Before you judge me, I hope you understand the context of this story. My name is Carmen Hernandez, and I'm 71 years old. I live in a small house in San Antonio, Texas, where the scorching summer heat was beginning to give way to the gentle warmth of early September when my son-in-law's latest act of cruelty finally pushed me to my breaking point. The evening air carried the familiar scent of barbacoa from the neighborhood taqueria and the distant sound of children playing in Brackenridge Park, but inside my modest living room, all I could feel was the sting of humiliation that had become far too familiar over the past 3 years. "Carmen, I need you to understand something clearly," Roberto said, standing in my doorway with his arms crossed and his face set in that expression of cold superiority I had come to dread. "My children don't need to be exposed to your outdated ways of thinking. Your constant interference in how we raise Sofia and Miguel is becoming a real problem." I looked at my son-in-law, this man who had married my daughter Isabella 5 years ago, and tried to reconcile the arrogant, dismissive person before me with the sweet little boy I had once known. But that connection was buried so deep under years of hostility that I could barely remember it myself. "I was only trying to help Sofia with her Spanish homework," I said quietly, my voice barely audible even in the small space between us. "She asked me to help her practice her pronunciation." "That's exactly what I'm talking about," Roberto snapped, his dark eyes flashing with irritation. "We've decided that the children should focus on English primarily. Spanish can confuse them academically, and frankly, it's not going to help them succeed in the real world. I don't want you undermining our decision by encouraging this backward thinking." The words hit me like physical blows. Backward thinking. As if my language, my culture, my heritage were somehow shameful obstacles to my grandchildren's success rather than gifts to be cherished and preserved. I had been born in San Antonio, had lived here my entire life, had raised 3 successful children who were all bilingual and proud of their Mexican-American heritage. But according to Roberto, everything I represented was holding his children back. "Isabella, surely you don't agree with this," I said, looking past Roberto to where my daughter stood in the hallway, her expression torn between loyalty to her husband and love for her mother. Isabella's silence stretched long enough to break my heart a little more. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Mom, maybe it would be better if you called before coming over to help with homework. Roberto and I need to be consistent with our parenting approach." I had been visiting my grandchildren every Tuesday after school for the past 2 years, helping them with homework and sharing stories about our family history. It had become the highlight of my week, the time when I felt most useful and connected to the new generation. But now, even that small joy was being taken away from me. "I've been coming on Tuesdays for 2 years," I said, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. "The children expect me. Sofia was so excited to show me her project about family traditions." "That's another thing," Roberto interrupted. "This obsession with family traditions and old country nonsense is exactly what I'm talking about. My children are Americans, Carmen. They don't need to be weighed down by stories about people who died before they were born or customs that have no relevance to their lives." I stared at him in shock. Those family traditions he dismissed so casually were the stories of their great-grandparents, who had worked in the fields and saved every penny to give their children better opportunities. They were tales of resilience, sacrifice, and love that had shaped our family for generations. But to Roberto, they were just old country nonsense. "Roberto, those stories are part of who they are," I said, finding my voice despite the trembling in my chest. "They connect the children to their roots, help them understand where they come from." "They come from me and Isabella," he said firmly. "That's all they need to know. And frankly, Carmen, I think it's time you stopped trying to live your life through my children. You had your chance to raise kids. Now it's our turn, and we don't need your constant interference." The cruelty of his words took my breath away. I wasn't trying to live my life through anyone. I was trying to be a grandmother, to share my love and knowledge with children who carried my blood. But Roberto made it sound like some kind of pathetic desperation on my part. After they left, that evening I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by the photographs and mementos that told the story of my life. Pictures of my late husband, Manuel, at our wedding 47 years ago. Photos of Isabella, my son Carlos, and my daughter Maria at various stages of their childhood. School projects and artwork that my grandchildren had made for me over the years, each one now feeling like evidence of the interference Roberto resented. I thought about the irony of the situation. Roberto Morales, who treated me like an unwelcome intruder in my own daughter's life, had no idea that I was the reason he was alive to have this conversation. He had no memory of the terrified, malnourished 7-year-old boy I had found 15 years ago in circumstances that still haunted my dreams. He had no recollection of the woman who had literally saved his life and changed the trajectory of his future forever. It had been 15 years since that October evening when I was working my shift as a nurse at University Hospital. I had been in pediatric emergency care for over 20 years by then, but I had never seen a case quite like Roberto's. He had been brought in by social services, unconscious and severely dehydrated, his small body bearing evidence of prolonged neglect and abuse that made even veteran hospital staff struggle to maintain their professional composure. The boy had been found alone in a condemned apartment building, where he had apparently been living by himself for several days after his drug-addicted mother had abandoned him. He was dangerously underweight, suffering from pneumonia, and his medical chart revealed a history of hospitalizations for suspicious injuries that had somehow never triggered the intervention they should have. I had been assigned as his primary nurse during his 3-week stay at the hospital, and something about his quiet resilience had touched my heart in a way that went beyond professional duty. Even as he recovered physically, it was clear that his emotional wounds ran much deeper. He barely spoke, flinched at sudden movements, and seemed to expect kindness to be followed by cruelty. During those long weeks, I had spent extra time with him, reading stories, helping him with the schoolwork the hospital teacher provided, and slowly coaxing smiles from a child who had forgotten how to trust adults. When it became clear that his mother would not be returning and that his father was unknown, I had advocated fiercely for him within the foster care system, making sure he was placed with a family who understood the depth of his trauma and were committed to his healing. The Martinez family had been perfect for Roberto. They were experienced foster parents who specialized in helping children who had suffered severe abuse and neglect. They were patient, loving, and skilled at helping damaged children learn to trust again. Over the years, I had followed Roberto's progress through occasional updates from social services and had been thrilled to learn that the Martinezes had eventually adopted him, giving him the stable, loving home he had never known. I had lost track of him after that, assuming he had moved on to live the normal, happy life he deserved. I never could have imagined that 15 years later, he would walk back into my life as my daughter's boyfriend and eventually husband, with no memory of our previous connection. When Isabella first brought Roberto home 3 years before their wedding, I had recognized him immediately, despite the years that had passed. The scared little boy had grown into a handsome, confident man, but certain features, the shape of his eyes, a small scar on his forehead from an old injury, were unmistakable. I had been overjoyed to see how well he had turned out, how completely he had overcome the trauma of his early childhood. But Roberto showed no signs of recognizing me. This wasn't surprising. Children who experience severe trauma often have gaps in their memory, and he had been quite ill during much of his hospital stay. I had debated whether to tell him about our history, but something had held me back. He seemed happy and well-adjusted, and I worried that bringing up his traumatic past might cause unnecessary pain. As their relationship progressed and they eventually married, I had expected that my connection to Roberto might create a special bond between us. I imagined that somehow, on some unconscious level, he might feel the love and care I had shown him during his darkest moments. Instead, from the very beginning, he had treated me with a coldness that bordered on hostility. It started with small things, dismissing my opinions during family conversations, making jokes about traditional Mexican mothers that felt pointed and cruel, showing obvious irritation when Isabella wanted to spend time with me. As the years passed, his disrespect had grown more overt and more painful. Now, sitting in my quiet house with the weight of Roberto's latest humiliation fresh in my memory, I found myself facing a decision that felt both heartbreaking and necessary. Should I tell him the truth about our history? Should I reveal that the woman he treated with such contempt was the same person who had advocated for him when he was helpless and alone? Part of me wanted to hurt him the way he had hurt me, to see his smug confidence crumble when he realized how wrong he had been about me. But a larger part of me remembered the broken little boy who had needed someone to fight for him, and I knew that revealing the truth would have to be about more than revenge. As I prepared for bed that night, I made a decision that would change everything for our family. It was time for Roberto to learn the truth about his past and about the woman he had been treating like an unwelcome stranger. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of helping him remember not just who he was, but who had been there when he needed someone most. The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. After a restless night of weighing my options, I had decided that Roberto deserved to know the truth about his past, not as a weapon to hurt him, but as a bridge to understanding. The 7-year-old boy I had cared for 15 years ago was still somewhere inside the man who now treated me with such disdain, and perhaps reconnecting him with that part of his history might help heal the wounds that neither of us fully understood. Spent the morning going through the storage boxes in my spare bedroom, searching for the items I had saved from Roberto's time at the hospital. As a pediatric nurse, I had learned that traumatized children often found comfort in small mementos: a drawing they had made, a book that had been read to them, a photograph from a happier moment. I had kept these things for many of my young patients over the years, hoping that someday they might want to reclaim pieces of their childhood. In a manila envelope marked Roberto M., October 2009, I found what I was looking for. There was a crayon drawing he had made during his second week in the hospital, a simple picture of a house with a woman in a nurse's cap standing next to a small boy. At the time, he had told me it was Nurse Carmen and me at the safe place. There was also a photo the hospital photographer had taken during the children's Halloween party that year, showing Roberto in a Superman costume I had bought for him, his arm around my waist as we both smiled at the camera. Most importantly, there was a letter I had written to his file, advocating for his placement with the Martinez family. In it, I had detailed not just his medical needs, but my observations about his personality, his intelligence, and his potential for recovery with the right support. Reading it again after 15 years, I was struck by how clearly I had seen the good man this traumatized child could become. That afternoon, I called Isabella and asked if I could come over to talk with her and Roberto. My voice must have carried some unusual gravity because she immediately agreed, despite Roberto's recent restrictions on my visits. "Mom, is everything okay?" "You sound strange," Isabella said when she answered the door an hour later. "I need to tell you and Roberto something important," I said, holding the envelope carefully against my chest. "Something about his past that I think he deserves to know." Roberto appeared in the doorway behind Isabella, his expression immediately defensive. "Carmen, if this is about yesterday, I thought I made my position clear. We don't need any more drama or guilt trips. This isn't about yesterday," I said quietly. "This is about 15 years ago, when a little boy named Roberto Morales was brought to University Hospital, and I was the nurse assigned to take care of him." I watched Roberto's face carefully as I spoke, looking for any flicker of recognition. For a moment, his expression remained skeptical, but then something shifted. A tiny furrow appeared between his eyebrows, as if he was trying to remember something just beyond his reach. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Isabella looked between us with growing confusion. Mom, what are you saying? Roberto grew up with the Martinez family. They adopted him when he was young. Before the Martinez family, mijo, I said gently, using the endearment I had called him during those long weeks in the hospital. Before, you had a safe home and parents who loved you. Do you remember being in the hospital when you were 7 years old? Roberto's face went very still. I could see him struggling with memories that were probably fragmented and painful. Children who experience severe trauma often bury those memories as a survival mechanism, but sometimes the right trigger could bring pieces back to the surface. There was a hospital, he said slowly, his voice taking on a younger quality. I was sick. There were people in white coats and... He stopped, his breathing becoming more rapid. There was a nurse who read you stories, I prompted gently, who brought you Superman comic books because you told her he was your favorite superhero, who stayed with you during the thunderstorm because you were afraid of the loud noises. Roberto's eyes widened, and I could see the memories beginning to surface. Carmen, he whispered, and for a moment, he looked exactly like the frightened little boy I had comforted all those years ago. I opened the envelope and pulled out the drawing he had made. You drew this for me during your second week in the hospital. You said it was the safe place where nobody could hurt you anymore. Roberto took the drawing with shaking hands, staring at the crayon figures as if they were ancient artifacts. I remember this, he said in amazement. I remember. You stayed with me when I had nightmares. You told me stories about brave knights and dragons. And you told me you wanted to be a superhero when you grew up, so you could protect other kids who were scared and alone, I added, pulling out the Halloween photograph. Isabella gasped when she saw the picture. Roberto, you never told me about any of this. You said you didn't remember much from before the Martinez family. I don't remember much, Roberto said, still staring at the photograph. The social worker said it was normal for kids who went through trauma to block out memories. But this... He looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before. Vulnerable, confused, and filled with a growing sense of recognition. You were there. You took care of me. For 3 weeks, I confirmed. You were so sick when they brought you in, mijo. Pneumonia, malnutrition, dehydration. You had been living alone in that abandoned building for days before someone found you. Roberto sank onto the couch, the documents scattered around him like pieces of a puzzle he was finally able to solve. My mother, she left me there. I remember being hungry, being cold. I remember thinking nobody was ever going to come. But someone did come, I said, sitting down across from him. And when you got to the hospital, you weren't alone anymore. I made sure of that. Isabella was crying now, overwhelmed by this revelation about her husband's past. Mom, why didn't you tell us? When Roberto and I started dating, why didn't you say anything? I wasn't sure it was my place, I admitted. And Roberto seemed so happy, so well-adjusted. I didn't want to bring up painful memories that might hurt him. I thought maybe it was better to let the past stay buried. But you recognized me immediately? Roberto asked. The moment Isabella brought you home for the first time. You've changed, of course, but certain things. Your eyes, the way you tilt your head when you're thinking. I could never forget the children I cared for. Roberto was quiet for a long time, processing this information. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. The letter you mentioned, about advocating for my placement, do you still have it? I handed him the letter I had written to his social worker, recommending the Martinez family specifically because of their experience with traumatized children. Roberto read it slowly, his eyes filling with tears as he took in my detailed observations about his intelligence, his resilience, and his potential for healing. You wrote that I was a remarkable child with tremendous capacity for love, who deserves a family that will cherish and protect him, Roberto read aloud. You said that with the right support, I could overcome anything. I believed that then, and I still believe it now, I said. You've become exactly the man I hoped you would become, Roberto. Successful, loving, a good father to your children. But I've been terrible to you, he said, the realization hitting him with obvious force. All this time, I've been treating you like you were the enemy, and you were the one who saved my life. You don't remember being that frightened little boy because you've grown into a strong, confident man. That's exactly what I hoped would happen. But somewhere along the way, you started seeing my love for your family as a threat instead of a gift. Roberto stood up abruptly and began pacing, running his hands through his hair. I don't understand why I've been so hostile to you. It doesn't make sense. You saved my life. You fought for me when I had no one else. And I've been... He stopped pacing and turned to face me. God, Carmen, I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry. The apology was heartfelt, but I could see that Roberto was struggling with something deeper than just guilt over his recent behavior. What is it, mijo? What are you thinking? I'm thinking about my children, he said slowly. About how I've been trying to cut them off from their heritage, from their family history. I've been doing to them what was done to me, trying to erase their past, pretend it doesn't matter. Isabella reached for her husband's hand. Roberto, your childhood trauma is not the same as our children learning about their Mexican heritage, isn't it? He asked. I've been so afraid of them being seen as different, of them struggling because of their background. But that fear, that shame about where I came from, that's not protecting them. That's hurting them. I watched my son-in-law grapple with these realizations, and I felt my heart breaking for the little boy who had learned to be ashamed of his origins as a survival mechanism. Roberto, there's nothing wrong with being proud of your heritage while also building a successful life in America. You don't have to choose between the two. But I have been choosing, he said. I've been choosing to reject everything that reminded me of being poor, of being abandoned, of being different. And you represent everything I was trying to run away from. What do you mean? Roberto sat back down, his composure finally cracking. You're everything my mother wasn't. You're stable, loving, devoted to family. When you interact with my children the way a grandmother should, it reminds me of everything I missed, everything I lost. And instead of being grateful, I've been angry at you for having what I never had. The honesty of his confession took my breath away. Oh, mijo, I said softly. I never wanted to make you feel that way. You didn't do anything wrong, Roberto said quickly. This is all on me. I've been projecting my own issues onto you, punishing you for reminding me of my past. But Carmen, I need you to know, those 3 weeks in the hospital with you were the first time in my life that I felt safe. You gave me that gift, and I've been too damaged to appreciate it. As the evening continued, Roberto shared more memories that were returning. The stories I had told him, the way I had advocated for him with doctors and social workers, the small kindnesses that had helped him begin to heal. With each memory, I could see him rebuilding his understanding of our relationship and his own history. I want my children to know these stories, Roberto said finally. Not the trauma, but the healing. I want them to understand that family is about more than just DNA. It's about people who choose to love you and fight for you when you can't fight for yourself. As I drove home that night, I felt lighter than I had in years. The little boy I had saved 15 years ago was finally ready to let himself be saved again. This time from the fear and shame that had been preventing him from accepting love. And perhaps most importantly, my grandchildren would grow up knowing their full heritage, including the story of how sometimes strangers become family through acts of pure love. The days following our emotional conversation brought a transformation. In Roberto, that was as dramatic as it was heartwarming. He called me the next morning, his voice still carrying the wonder of someone processing long-buried memories that were continuing to surface. Carmen, I remembered something else, he said, without preamble when I answered the phone. You used to sing to me. Mexican lullabies. I couldn't understand all the words, but your voice made me feel safe. I felt tears spring to my eyes at the memory. Las mañanitas, I said softly, and Duérmete mi niño. You used to ask me to sing them when you had trouble falling asleep. I've been humming those melodies for years without knowing where they came from, Roberto said with amazement. Sometimes when I'm stressed, I catch myself humming them and it calms me down. I never understood why until now. Over the following week, Roberto began making deliberate efforts to repair the damage his years of hostility had caused. He called to apologize formally, not just for the incident about Spanish homework, but for the pattern of disrespect that had characterized our entire relationship. More importantly, he began asking questions about our family history that he had previously dismissed as irrelevant. "Tell me about my great-grandfather," he said during one afternoon visit, settling into my living room chair with the kind of genuine interest I had never seen from him before. "Sophia mentioned you were telling her about someone who worked in the railroad yards." I pulled out the photo albums I had tried to share so many times before, watching Roberto's face as I told him about his great-grandfather Miguel, who had come to Texas as a young man with nothing but determination and had worked his way up from track maintenance to foreman. The stories that Roberto had once called old country nonsense now held his complete attention. "He sounds like he was an incredible man," Roberto said, studying a sepia-toned photograph of Miguel in his railroad uniform. "Sophia should know about him. Both children should." The change in Roberto affected the entire family dynamic. Isabella, who had been caught between loyalty to her husband and love for her mother, began to relax as the tension that had defined our family gatherings for years started to dissipate. Even more importantly, 8-year-old Sophia and 6-year-old Miguel began to benefit from having their father's permission to embrace their heritage rather than being ashamed of it. "Abuela, Papa says you're going to teach us how to make tamales for Christmas," Sophia announced excitedly during my first unrestricted visit in months. "He said it's important for us to know how to make the foods our family has always made." I looked over at Roberto, who was helping young Miguel with a puzzle at the kitchen table. "Did he really say that?" "He said a lot of things," Isabella interjected with a smile. "He's been talking non-stop about family traditions and how important it is for the children to understand where they come from. It's like someone flipped a switch inside him." But the most significant moment came 2 weeks later, when Roberto asked if he could see his complete hospital file from those 3 weeks in 2009. I had contacted the hospital's records department, and after Roberto signed the appropriate releases, they provided him with copies of everything: medical charts, nursing notes, social worker reports, and psychological evaluations. Roberto spent an entire evening reading through the documents, occasionally asking me to clarify medical terminology or explain references to specific incidents. The picture that emerged was both heartbreaking and inspiring. A severely traumatized child who had somehow retained enough trust and resilience to accept help when it was offered. "Listen to this," Roberto said, reading from one of my nursing notes. "Roberto asked today if I thought his mother would come back for him. When I explained that she wouldn't, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked if that meant no one would ever leave him again. I assured him that the Martinez family would love him forever, and he said, 'Like you love me, Nurse Carmen?' I told him yes, exactly like that." He smiled for the first time since his admission. Roberto's voice broke slightly as he read those words. "I remember that conversation now. You were the first person who ever promised me that love didn't have to end. And I meant it," I said. "That love hasn't ended, mijo. It's been here waiting for you to remember it." The psychological evaluation was particularly illuminating. It detailed Roberto's exceptional intelligence and emotional resilience, but also noted his hypervigilance around authority figures and his tendency to interpret kindness as potential deception. Reading it 15 years later, Roberto began to understand the psychological patterns that had shaped his adult relationships. No wonder I was suspicious of you, he said thoughtfully. According to this, I had learned to interpret adult attention as potentially dangerous. When you tried to be involved with my children, my brain was probably processing it as a threat, even though logically I knew you were just being a grandmother. Trauma affects people in ways they don't always understand, I said gently. The important thing is that you're understanding it now. But the most powerful moment came when Roberto found a letter I had written to him personally, sealed in an envelope marked, "For Roberto when he's ready." I had forgotten about that letter, written during my last shift before he was discharged to the Martinez family. Roberto opened it with trembling hands and read aloud. "Dear Roberto, by the time you read this, you'll be living with your new family, who will love you the way every child deserves to be loved. I want you to know that you are brave, smart, and worthy of all the good things that are coming your way. You survived something that would have broken many adults, and that makes you a superhero just like the ones in your comic books. If you ever forget how strong you are, remember that Nurse Carmen believes in you and always will. Love, Carmen." The room was completely quiet when Roberto finished reading. When he looked up, his eyes were filled with tears, but his expression was one of profound gratitude rather than sadness. "You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself," he said. "You saw potential in a broken little boy that even he couldn't see." "I saw the man you would become," I corrected. "And I was right." That evening, Roberto made a decision that surprised everyone. He wanted to contact the Martinez family, who had given him the loving home that had allowed him to heal and thrive. He had maintained a relationship with them over the years, but had never fully expressed his gratitude for the sacrifice they had made in taking on a severely traumatized child. "I need them to meet you," Roberto told me. "They need to know about Ishak, the nurse who prepared me to receive their love. They need to understand the full story of how I came to be their son." The reunion with Maria and Carlos Martinez was deeply emotional. They remembered the reports they had received about my advocacy for Roberto's placement, and Maria confessed that she had always wanted to thank the nurse who had fought so hard for her future son. Roberto arrived at our home already beginning to heal, Maria told me, but he wouldn't tell us much about his time in the hospital. Now I understand why he always hummed those Mexican lullabies when he was nervous. "You gave him something beautiful to carry with him," Carlos added. "You prepared him to trust us. Without your work, he might never have been able to accept our love." As the evening progressed, we shared stories about Roberto's childhood with the Martinez family, filling in gaps that helped him understand his own journey more completely. For the first time, Roberto could see his life as a continuous story rather than fragments separated by trauma. The most touching moment came when young Sophia, who had been listening quietly to the adult conversation, approached her father with a serious expression. "Papa, is Abuela Carmen like your superhero?" she asked. "Like the one who saved you when you were little?" Roberto knelt down to his daughter's level, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Yes, mija, Abuela Carmen is exactly like a superhero. She saved me when I was scared and alone, and she's been protecting our family ever since, even when I was too foolish to understand." As I drove home that night, I reflected on the incredible journey that had brought us to this point. The angry, dismissive man who had treated me like an unwelcome intruder had transformed back into the grateful child who had once drawn pictures of us together in the safe place. But more than that, he had become a man capable of facing his past, understanding his patterns, and choosing to break cycles that might have damaged his own children. Roberto was finally ready to let himself be loved completely, by his adoptive parents, by his wife and children, and by the grandmother who had been waiting 15 years for him to remember that love had been there all along. 3 months after Roberto's memories had fully returned, our family was preparing for our first Christmas together as a truly united unit. The transformation in our relationships had been so complete that sometimes I had to remind myself this. was the same man who had once forbidden me from speaking Spanish to my grandchildren. Roberto had thrown himself into learning about our family history with the enthusiasm of someone making up for lost time. He had helped me organize all the old photographs into albums for the children, had recorded me telling family stories so they would never be lost, and had even started taking Spanish lessons so he could better understand the cultural elements he had rejected for so long. "Carmen, I want to ask you something important," Roberto said one December afternoon as we worked together in my kitchen, preparing tamales for the Christmas celebration. It had become our new tradition, something that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. "What is it, mijo?" I asked, pausing in my assembly of the corn husks. "I want to legally change my name to include Hernandez. Roberto Morales Hernandez. I know it might seem strange since we're not blood relatives, but you're the one who gave me my real family name. The Martinez family gave me love and stability, but you gave me my first sense of belonging somewhere." The request took my breath away. "Roberto, are you sure? That's a big decision." "I've never been more sure of anything," he said firmly. "For 15 years I've been trying to run away from my past, but my past includes you. It includes the moment when a 7-year-old boy learned that someone could love him without wanting anything in return. I want my children to understand that family isn't just about blood or adoption papers. It's about people who choose to fight for you." Isabella, who had been listening from the doorway, came into the kitchen with tears in her eyes. "I think that's beautiful, Roberto. The children would be so proud to carry Abuela's name too." That Christmas morning brought a surprise that none of us had expected. Roberto presented me with a thick scrapbook he had been secretly preparing for weeks. The first page contained the original drawing he had made in the hospital, now professionally, matted and framed. But the rest of the book told the story of his life since leaving the hospital. Graduation photos, pictures from his wedding to Isabella, the birth of his children, his promotion at the engineering firm where he worked. "I realized that you missed all of this," Roberto explained, as I turned the pages with wonder. "You saved my life, but you never got to see what that life became. I wanted you to understand that every good thing that happened to me grew from the seed of hope you planted during those 3 weeks." The final page of the scrapbook contained a letter Roberto had written to me, dated that very morning. "Dear Carmen, 15 years ago, you told a broken little boy that he was worthy of love. Today, that boy has grown into a man who finally understands what a gift that was. You didn't just save my life, you taught me how to live it. You showed me that love doesn't always come from the people who are supposed to love you, but sometimes from strangers who choose to see your worth when you can't see it yourself. I'm sorry it took me so long to remember this lesson. I'm sorry I hurt you when you were trying to give my children the same gift of unconditional love that you gave me. But I'm grateful that your love was strong enough to wait for me to come back to it. Thank you for being my first mother, even if I wasn't your biological son. Thank you for being my children's abuela, even when I made it difficult. Thank you for teaching all of us that family is created through love, not just through genetics. I am proud to be your son in every way that matters." As I read Roberto's letter aloud to the family gathered in my living room, I thought about the miraculous journey that had brought us to this moment. The hostile stranger who had tried to erase my grandchildren's heritage had revealed himself to be the same precious child I had rocked to sleep with Mexican lullabies 15 years ago. But the most meaningful moment came later that afternoon when 8-year-old Sofia approached me with a piece of paper in her hands. "Abuela, I drew something for you," she said shyly, presenting me with a crayon drawing that took my breath away. The picture showed our entire family standing together in front of a house, but in the center was a woman in a nurse's cap holding the hand of a small boy. At the bottom, in Sofia's careful handwriting, were the words, "Abuela Carmen saves Papa so he can love us." "Papa told me the story about when you were his nurse," Sofia explained. "He said that's why we have our family now, because you took care of him when he was little and scared. He said, "You're like a guardian angel who helps people find their families." I looked across the room at Roberto, who was watching this exchange with an expression of pure love and gratitude. The man who had once dismissed family stories as worthless was now making sure his children understood the most important story of all: how love can bridge any gap, heal any wound, and create family connections that transcend biology. "Sophia, this is the most beautiful picture anyone has ever drawn for me," I said, pulling my granddaughter into a hug. "And you're right. Sometimes we help people find their families, and sometimes we discover that we were always family ourselves." 6 months later, Roberto and I were working together at a local foster care facility, volunteering with children who had experienced trauma similar to what he had endured. It had been his idea to give back, to help other scared children understand that their current circumstances didn't define their futures. "I want them to see what's possible," Roberto explained to the facility director as we prepared for our first day of volunteering. "I want them to know that someone like them grew up to have a beautiful family and a successful career. But mostly, I want them to meet Carmen, because every child deserves to know that there are people in the world who will fight for them." Watching Roberto read stories to a 7-year-old girl who had been found in circumstances eerily similar to his own, I marveled at how completely he had embraced his past rather than running from it. The shame and fear that had made him push me away for years had been transformed into compassion and strength that he now used to help others. "Roberto," I said, as we drove home after our first volunteer session, "your biological mother abandoned you. But look what grew from that tragedy. Your adoptive parents gave you stability and love. I gave you your first sense of safety, and now you're using all of that to help other children. You've turned your pain into purpose." "We turned it into purpose," Roberto corrected. "This only works because we're doing it together. Those kids need to see that healing is possible, but they also need to see what love looks like when it's unconditional and permanent. You represent that for them, just like you did for me." A year after our reconciliation, Roberto surprised the entire family by organizing a celebration that honored what he called the day our real family story began. He had researched the exact date when I had first been assigned as his nurse, and he declared it a new family holiday. "Other families celebrate the day children are born or adopted," Roberto announced at the gathering. "But our family celebrates the day a nurse named Carmen Hernandez decided that a scared little boy was worth saving. That's when our story really started." The celebration included all the people who had played important roles in Roberto's healing journey: the Martinez family, his social workers, even Dr. Patricia Williams, who had been his primary physician during his hospital stay. As I listened to these people share their memories of Roberto's recovery, I realized that I had been just one link in a chain of love that had transformed a broken child into a whole man. But the most touching moment came when Roberto presented me with a special gift, a photo album documenting our volunteer work together. The pictures showed us reading to children, helping with homework, and providing comfort during difficult moments. In many of the photos, I could see echoes of that original relationship between a traumatized boy and the nurse who had refused to give up on him. "This is our legacy," Roberto said as I turned through the pages. "Not just the fact that you saved me, but the fact that together we're saving others. Every child who learns to trust again, every kid who discovers their own worth, they're all part of the family that started 15 years ago in room 314 of University Hospital." As I looked around the room at our extended family, biological relatives, adoptive relatives, chosen relatives, and the children we were helping to heal, I understood that Roberto was right. Our story wasn't just about one nurse and one patient, or even about one family's reconciliation. It was about the way love multiplies when we choose to pass it forward rather than holding it back. The angry son-in-law, who had once treated me like garbage, had transformed into a man who understood that the greatest gift we can give children is the knowledge that they are worthy of love, protection, and belonging. He had learned this lesson twice, once as a 7-year-old patient and again as an adult, remembering where his healing had begun. On the drive home that evening, Roberto's children chattering excitedly in the back seat about the new friends they had made at the foster facility, I reflected on the profound truth we had all discovered. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are simply those who have forgotten how to accept love. And sometimes the greatest act of love is to keep loving them anyway, until they remember who they really are. Roberto had needed 15 years to remember that he was worthy of the love I had offered him as a child. But once he remembered that love didn't just heal our relationship, it became a force for healing others, creating ripples of hope that would touch countless lives in the years to come. As we pulled into my driveway, Sofia called out from the back seat, "Abuela, will you teach us more songs in Spanish next week? Papa says we should learn all the lullabies you used to sing to him." "Of course, mija," I replied, meeting Roberto's eyes in the rearview mirror and seeing there the same trust and gratitude I had seen in a 7-year-old boy 15 years ago. "I'll teach you every song I know, and we'll pass them down to your children and their children after that. Because that's what families do. They take love that begins in one moment, one relationship, one act of choosing to care for someone who needs care, and they grow it into something that lasts for generations. Our family had learned that lesson the hard way, but we had learned it completely, and now we would never forget it again."